In this video, we're going to go over the tones of Pingji, and this is what makes Pingji unique among the other Cantonese romanizations. So briefly, let's talk about the tones in Cantonese. Here are two diagrams that are very simplistic. In general, there are 6 tones in Cantonese. We have 3 flat tones. That's tone 1, tone 3, and tone 6. They're high, mid, and low. And then you have the other 3 tones which kind of go up or go down. Now, one thing to pay attention is how this diagram works. You can see that on the x-axis, that's duration. So as you speak the word, it changes in pitch, which is the y-axis. So for example, with tone 2, you can see this starts mid and then goes up to high. So that's rising, and that's how that diagram works. Here's another diagram that's a little bit more accurate and based off actual data. And here the main reason why I want to point this out is actually most of the tones start fairly low in pitch. So tones 2, 4, 5, and 6 all start in the relatively low pitch area, whereas tone 1 is the only one that starts high, and then tone 3 also kind of starts a little bit higher. That's important to note because we designed the system around this fact. So the tone letters are meant to be intuitive and act as a visual guide to see the tone and speak the word as fast as possible. This is in contrast to having numbered tones at the end of the word, for example, as in Yuping. It does not really work well for natural reading and speaking. So let me give you an example. So here we have a poem that I'm bringing back again from the very beginning of this video series. This is written in Yuping, so you can see the tones are at the end, and the tones represent their exact number. So that's actually another disadvantage where in Yuping, you actually have to know what number each tone is. I'm sure there are many speakers of Cantonese that don't know what number they're actually saying. They just know the actual cadence. The other thing I want to focus on is, as you're reading this, just kind of follow with me here. So this first word, it says chun when you pronounce it, chun. But then you get to the end of the word and then you say, oh wait, this is first tone. Before you actually say the word in your head or speak it out loud, then you have to go back and now raise your pitch, chun. So if you're already speaking it, then you're kind of catching yourself off guard. Chun, oh wait, chun. And then you go to the next word, mean, oh, it's a downward tone, so mean. And then you have to keep on going forward, then back, forward, then back, forward, then back. And it's very difficult to read that way. It works fine when it's just one word at a time, which is in some cases how people learn. But if you're actually putting any string of words together, then it's not very practical. So the way the system works in Pingji is just how phonetic letters kind of tell you the order of how to pronounce a word. So for example, in the English word dog, you have D-O-G that tells you to pronounce those sounds in that order. D-O-G, dog. So we use that same feature in Pingji that when you see a tone letter, and you'll know when you see a tone letter because I'll describe the rules for that, that tells you to change your pitch to a high pitch. Otherwise, we're going to assume that whenever you read a word, you're going to start low, and until you encounter that tone letter, then you're going to change the pitch. So let me demonstrate what I mean by that. So here I have a similar graph of pitch versus time. And now I'm going to give you an English sentence. And the reason I'm going to give you an English sentence is because English also has tones. But unlike Cantonese, in English, tones are used to stress certain words and also to change the meaning of a sentence. So are you asking a question? Are you doing something else? So tone has a lot of value. So I'm going to give you an example of that. Okay, so here's a sentence. He loves to eat raw seafood. In the standard American English dialect, American tends to have a very flat, monotonous pitch throughout. So when you read this, it's he loves to eat raw seafood. It's pretty straight and flat like this. But now let's change it to a question mark. And adding this one symbol completely changes the meaning and pronunciation of the sentence. Now it's he loves to eat raw seafood. So if I were to write this out, he loves to eat raw seafood. So my pitch goes up at the very end. And then in English, that's how we know we're asking a question. So that question mark tells us to change your pitch as you get closer. Okay, here's another quick example. He loves to eat raw seafood. He loves to eat raw seafood. So that's kind of what the exclamation point does. It makes your pitch go down. Now, what if I want the pitch to go up earlier? So let's look at one last example. So in English, sometimes we like to use all capital letters or use italic or bold fonts, but basically we're highlighting the word loves. So when you read this sentence, he loves to eat raw seafood. So he loves to eat raw seafood. That's kind of how you pronounce that sentence. So the act of capitalization of this word makes me raise the pitch. So hopefully all this makes sense. I'm basically using a transformation to change how we use our tones when we speak it. So the same rules apply when writing Pingji to represent Cantonese, but instead of modifying a sentence like we do in English, we're going to modify each word individually because that's what tonal languages do. The tones change the meaning of the word rather than the whole sentence. Okay, so in those examples, I used punctuation marks to change the tone for those English sentences. In Pingji, we're going to add silent letters at the end, but they're not really silent letters, they're tone letters. And if you think this might be weird that we're adding these letters that otherwise have different meanings, just think about the French language, which does this all the time. So many people are familiar with the English phrase RSVP, to RSVP to something. That's actually from French, répondez s'il vous plaît. And if you look at that actual phrase, it's full of silent letters. The Z at the end of répondez is silent, the L is silent, the S is silent, and the T is silent. So many silent letters. Well, we're actually going to put those to use in Pingji. And one thing to keep in mind is that Cantonese only has 6 possible final consonants. So that's M, N, Q, P, T, and K, your 3 stops and your 3 nasals. If you see an ending quote-unquote consonant letter that is not one of those, then that's going to be a tone letter. All right, so let's dive into all the tones now. So let's start with tone 1, which is the high level tone. So you kind of pronounce that like this, very high and flat. So the rule for that is you put an apostrophe at the beginning of the word. So here are some simple examples. Mama, as in mother. Yat, as in the word one. And which is a common final particle. And one thing to note is now we have the ability to actually write out words in the complete Pingji alphabet. So again, to emphasize, the apostrophe at the very beginning of the word tells you to immediately shift to a high pitch and keep it flat for the rest of the word. Now there's one exception to this tone, and that's if the word starts with the letter C, Z, S, or W. And in that case, you add an H after the consonant. So that becomes CH, ZH, SH, and WH. For anyone familiar with pinyin, CH, ZH, and SH are also very common digraphs. So part of this is to kind of share some similarities with pinyin. And then WH is also very common in English, so it just doesn't look out of place. And the reason why this is because if there are too many apostrophes, it kind of messes up the flow of reading, having them all over the place. It just looks better this way. And the next thing I want to go over is why I use the letter H. Okay, so here's something resembling that diagram of all the different tones, having the high, mid, and low areas. Well, we're going to superimpose a letter on top of that. So for example, when you could write something like that. So the reason why I use the letter H is because if you look at the letter itself, it's one of the few letters that goes all the way to the top of your writing space. So that symbolizes that it's a high pitch tone letter. Another reason why H is great is because it's a very non-obtrusive letter. For example, if I write the word wa and I add an H after it, I don't really change the sound, it's still wa, so that makes it a perfect tone letter. Okay, let's look at some examples of some words using the tone 1 spelling exception. So first we have the word si, then tut, then zao, and then wan. So we got one example of each. Okay, next we're going to go into tone 2, which is the mid-rising tone. So it's a rising tone, like that. And for tone 2, we're again going to use the same letter H, because again, H represents a high pitch. And in this case, because it's a rising tone, the high pitch is at the end of the word. So it's going to come after the vowel, but before the final consonant. So here are some examples. Hai, go, sai, sang. So again, as you can see in the last word sang, the H is before the final consonant. Our next tone is tone 3, which is the mid-level tone, and that's basically a flat tone, kind of like this. And because it's a flat tone, we're going to use a letter that gives us kind of a flat shape. Okay, so going back to our drawing board, we're going to use the letter R here. So you see how the lowercase r has this kind of flat hook at the mid-level? And that's why we're using this to represent the mid-flat tone. Okay, so the rules for using the letter R is that it comes after the initial consonant. If you have a word that doesn't have an initial consonant and it starts with a vowel instead, then the R goes after the vowel. So let's look at some examples. Go, ma, fun, dong, a. So in most of these cases, the R goes in between the initial consonant and the vowel, but in the very last one, there is no consonant, so it just goes at the end. So AR. The next three tones all start in the low pitch range. The first of them is tone 4, which is the low falling tone. So it's a falling tone. And this tone uses the letter S, which comes at the end of the word. All right, so let's go back to our trusty diagram. So why the letter S? Well, when you draw the letter S, you notice how it has a top part and a bottom part. Think of those as the difference between a mid-level and a low level, and the line that goes in between them is representing a falling tone. So as it goes from left to right, it goes from top to bottom. Now while I'm here, I'm also going to cover tone 5, which is the opposite. It's a low rising tone, so we're going to use the letter Z for that, and it's basically a similar pattern. Again, there is a top portion to the letter, a bottom portion to the letter, and as you go from left to right, it goes up. So the letter basically is an arrow. S goes down, a Z goes up. Okay, so going back to tone 4, which is the letter S, I just have one example here, and that's the word for paternal grandma, ma, as in ma. Next is tone 5, which I've already been talking about. That's the low rising, so it's a slow rising tone. And this is basically the same thing. The letter Z comes at the end of the word. Okay, so here are some examples of that. Ma, ngo, ne, koi. And for anyone who's confused about the difference between 2 and 5, which are both rising tones, 2 is a much higher rising tone. So, for example, if you say the English word what, written like this, what, that's a high rising, as opposed to tone 5, where that would be like the English word huh, huh. So again, this is just a low rising, like ma, ngo, ne, koi. Okay, so finally we have tone 6, which is the low level tone. So it's low and flat, kind of like this. This one actually has 3 different spelling rules, and they all depend on how the word ends. So does the word end with a vowel? Does it end with a stop, as in PTK? Or does it end with a nasal, MNQ? So the first is when there's no final consonant. In other words, it ends with a vowel. Here we have it ending with the letter J. Okay, let's go back to our diagram one last time. Here we have the letter J. And if you notice, the J hooks down and goes low. And you have this low, flat curvature at the bottom. So that's the low, flat portion of the letter. And that symbolizes the tone. So as you can see, every single tone letter was chosen based on the shape of the letter. And that's a mnemonic device to help you remember which tone is which. Alright, so going back to the rules. That's the first rule. So the next rule is when the final consonant is a p, t, or k sound. Here the rule is use the non-aspirated counterpart of the consonant. So what I mean by that? So remember when I introduced the consonants, each of these letters had a counterpart. So p with b, t with d, and k with g. And so you're just gonna use the other letter. So replace p with a b, t with a d, and k with a g. And this is actually the only tone rule in Pingji where you don't add an extra letter, you just simply replace the letter. Finally, the last rule is when the last consonant is a nasal, so the or sound, and you just simply add an n to that letter, so mn, nn, or nq. Alright, let's look at some examples of these. So in the top row, we have 2 words that end with vowels, hai and ma. So these both have the letter J after them. On the left side in red, we have words that end with a stop, so sup, yut, and bak. And basically, the way I like to think about these letters is, again, using English as an example. So compare the word bat versus bad. When you say bat, it's a very quick and short word, but when you say bad, B-A-D, you have to drag out the word so that everyone can hear the D, bad. So in this case, for tone 6, you're not dragging out the word, but you're lowering your pitch. So sup, yut, and bak. Hopefully that makes sense. And in the bottom right, we have the words in blue, which end in nasals. So sum, mun, and yong. And again, my mnemonic for this is kind of similar. When you're having this double letter at the end, it kind of feels like you're dragging the word a little bit longer. or in this case, dragging the word into a continued low pitch. So since this is probably the most complicated tone, just take a couple seconds to understand these 3 rules. Okay, and finally, as an overall summary, here's that graph again, which shows different words, but that are all pronounced like C, but have different tones. And I'm gonna review how these are all spelled in the different tones. So tone 1, C, that's S-H-I. Remember, this is the letter S, so it has the special rule of using the H right after it. That tells you to start high and end high. Next we have tone 2, C. The H is at the end of the word, which means you end the word with a high pitch, so high rising. Number 3, C, which is a mid-flat tone, and again it's flat like the roof of the letter R. Next is tone 4, C, the falling tone, falling just like the shape of the S. After that, C, the low rising tone, rising like the shape of the Z. And lastly, C, with the low hook of the J to represent the low flat tone. So that's it for the tones in Pingji. It's quite different than other romanization systems, so please feel free to watch the video again to make sure it makes sense. But I've tried to provide as much mnemonic help as possible and also to understand why I chose the letters I did. And in the last video, we're gonna put everything together.